Good afternoon, all of you who are signed in to Framing the Future, a webinar series in which we look at issues which will affect the future of forestry in Maryland. It's our pleasure today to have a very interesting topic, as we try every session to do. Today's topic is about habitat protection, and one of the most talked about subjects over the past year is the impact of forestry on bats, or maybe we should say the impact of bats on forestry, might be a better way to put it. I want to welcome all of you to today's webinar. I want to remind you that it is being recorded and will be available on Maryland's on our website, marylandforestryfoundation.org, in about a week. I want to thank you for joining us today. My name is Gary Allen. I am the president of the Maryland Forestry Foundation, and the series is Framing the Future. We want to welcome our moderator today for the series. That's Megan Carr, one of our early Mel Fellows. That's the fellowship program, which the foundation sponsors in higher education here in the state of Maryland, a program which currently has 4 active fellows, and we'll be seeing and hearing from them in June of this year to talk about their experience. But today's program is about habitat protection, and we'll be talking to a really excellent speaker. And I want to turn it over to our moderator and ask her to introduce the program and today's presentation. Thank you, Megan.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, welcome everyone. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we start our presentation. We welcome questions from everyone today, so if you do have questions for our speaker, please enter those in the Q&A function. It should be found at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will have time at the end of today's session. I'll be reading your questions aloud so that folks who are viewing this webinar on video at a later date can have the full context as we go through that discussion. So please do feel welcome to contribute those questions. Speaking of our website, Gary mentioned that you can view our previous webinars there. You can also sign up to be notified of our upcoming webinars. We typically just send out 1 email each month for you to learn about the next month's topic and to register to attend future installments of this series. So with that, we will move on towards our presentation from Heather Wallace, who's a senior biologist with Ecosystem Planning and Restoration. Ms. Wallace has 25 years of experience as an environmental professional, working in both public and private sectors. She has extensive experience surveying and monitoring plants and wildlife, and specialized knowledge of the ecology of North American bats. Ms. Wallace holds a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Native, Endangered, and Threatened Recovery Permit for multiple bat species, and has comprehensive knowledge of the Endangered Species Act consultation process, and has prepared numerous biological assessments and evaluations. So she's exceptionally well positioned to speak on this topic. With that, take it away, Heather.
Thank you, Megan. I should go ahead and share my screen. All right, can you all see that?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay. All righty, so Megan did such a great introduction there, and I'm really glad to be here with you all today and glad to talk about bats, my favorite subject. So yeah, I have spent the bulk of my career doing field biology and Endangered Species Act consultation. But my favorite taxa group of all is definitely bats. And I really am just very happy to be here and talk to you guys today about my favorite subject. So let's get started. So why do we care about bats? You know, bats are wrongly vilified. They have a bad rap for a lot of reasons, and they really shouldn't. Aside from the fact that all creatures have an inherent value, bats in particular, you know, have value for their own reasons. So they are wonderful at pest control. A recent study estimated that bats eat enough pests to save more than $1 billion annually in crop damage and pesticide costs to the U.S. corn industry, for example. They pollinate over 500 species of plants, including things like agave and mangoes and bananas. The frugivorous bats, that means fruit-eating bats, disperse seeds that generate new forests in the tropical regions. Vampire bats have actually been studied in the medical field. An anticoagulant in their saliva. It is being used to develop treatment for stroke victims. Bats in the US obviously are on, there are some bats on the endangered species list. So we do have to take those into consideration whenever we're performing activities in areas where we might impact them. So since most or perhaps all of you are based in Maryland, I'm going to go ahead and discuss the 3 federally listed bat species that occur in your state. All these bats rely on forests for their survival. And just a little couple tidbits of information about them. They're all pretty small. They have wingspans less than 12 inches and they all weigh less than 10 grams. So for reference, one single plain M&M weighs just under 1 gram. So think of holding 10 M&Ms in your hand, and that's about how much an Indiana bat weighs, for instance. They're all insectivorous. And in Maryland, in Maryland, they do hibernate in the wintertime. They use caves and mines for hibernation. In the summertime, you're going to find them using a variety of forest types. Some of them prefer to be more in cluttered, high-density type forests, whereas others will venture out into the margins of woodlands and forage over some fields and near ponds and things like that. But primarily, these are forest bats. Occasionally, you might also find them roosting in buildings, under bridges, or using culverts. Tricolored bats in particular seem to like culverts. So the bats are endangered for a variety of reasons. Indiana bats were listed way back in 1968. And at the time, the biggest impact to that species was destruction of their cave habitats. They, along with the other 2 listed species in Maryland, the northern long-eared bat and the tricolor bat, which actually is right now not officially listed as endangered, but we're almost there. They are susceptible to a disease called white nose syndrome. So if you're not familiar with that, it is a fatal fungal disease that affects hibernating bats in North America. So these are just the bats that use caves for hibernating in the winter. It was first identified in New York State in 2006, and it has spread nationwide and up into Canada since then. The fungus grows on exposed skin, so the nose, the wings, the tail membrane, things like that, causing the bats to wake up and burn energy reserves during hibernation. So what happens is they basically run out of energy to continue hibernating for the length of time they normally would. They go out on the landscape looking for insects that are not there because it is too cold, and they basically starve to death. So the disease is spread through direct contact between bats, or they can pick it up from infected surfaces within the hibernaculum. It's also spread by humans on gear that is contaminated with the fungus. So things like shoes, clothes, ropes, and other gear that are used, for instance, in caving activities. And it's really been a huge impact on cave bats in North America. Some bat colonies have experienced up to 100% mortality. So millions of bats have died at this point. I have a link there to the whitenosesyndrome.org website. I'm going to include lots of links in my presentation. I will send a copy of the presentation to Megan when we're all finished, and she can distribute it so that you have all these links available to you in the future. So you're going to hear me repeat this a lot during the presentation, but how can you, if you are aware of the fact that there may be bats that are potentially federally listed that occur within your project area, how can you try to make sure that your project activities are not going to have a detrimental effect on those bats? So you're going to want to coordinate with Fish and Wildlife Service. My presentation is going to be a pretty quick high-level overview of the consultation process and some of the guidelines that are currently in place to assist you in your sustainable forest management practices, but it's not going to cover everything. So again, I encourage you to coordinate with your local Fish and Wildlife Service office whenever you're working on a project and you anticipate you might have impacts to bats, or even if you're just not sure if you do, it's always a good idea to take that extra step and try to figure that out. So we're going to go over a few terms right now just to make sure we're all on the same page. with these definitions. You're going to hear the word take a lot. Take does not necessarily just mean kill. So by definition in the ESA, take means to harm, harass, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect, or to attempt to engage in any such conduct. So it's a pretty broad definition. And take may be permitted if incidental to another otherwise lawful activity, and when accompanied by mitigation. So not all take is bad necessarily. For instance, the permit that I hold from Fish and Wildlife Service allows me to take bats for the purpose of, say, mist netting. I'm actually handling them, which would fall under harassment. For another example, let's say you are working on a stream restoration project that goes through an area of forest where you're going to have to cut down some of those trees in order to reestablish the sinuosity of the channel. But then you're going to go back and plant more trees when the construction is finished. Those trees are eventually going to go up into a forest, grow up into a forest that could potentially support things like tricolored bats in your area. So that harm is actually temporary, and you're ultimately benefiting the species by replacing that forest and improving the water quality. Federal nexus. Okay. So this is another term I'm going to say a lot. When you have a federal nexus, it means a couple of different things. You could have an activity that is occurring on federal land, let's say a national forest, for instance, or an activity that is occurring on private land, but has a connection to a federal involvement. So for instance, let's say you are installing culverts in a stream system, and you have to get a permit from the Corps of Engineers for impacts to waters of the U.S. That would be your federal nexus. If you are working on a project that has federal grant funding, that would be a federal nexus. So again, real high level here, but we're going to talk about the Endangered Species Act consultation process. If you really want to nerd out, you can look up the consultation handbook with the link that I have provided there. It is extensive. It goes through all the details of the consultation process. But most people are not going to do that. Most people are going to visit the Information for Planning and Consultation website. We call it IPAC. That is maintained by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And on that website, you can either draw in or upload a shapefile or a KMZ of your project boundary, and click a couple buttons, and you're going to get a species list of federally listed species that could potentially occur within that project area. And we are lucky that Fish and Wildlife Service has developed a determination key, or a D key for short, for two bat species, the northern long-eared bat and the tricolor bat. Florida bonneted bat is also has a D key. We won't talk about that one today. And the D key, I'll go into more detail about that later, but it basically presents a question and answer process in order to help determine, based on your project activities, whether or not your project has the potential for take for either one of those species. So there's a couple different, I'll say, flavors of consultation. One is based on whether or not you have a federal nexus, and one is based on whether you don't have one. So again, for projects that have a federal nexus, things where you're working on a federally owned piece of property, or there's a federal permit or federal funds involved. Okay. So in order to comply with the Endangered Species Act, the federal agency, the lead federal agency, may need to produce a biological assessment if the thought is that there is going to be an adverse effect on a listed species. So that biological assessment is going to present the project actions. So any kind of activities associated with the project. It's going to present an effects analysis. So if you perform those activities, what effect may it have on those listed species? And then avoidance and minimization measures that could be or will be employed as part of the project in order to minimize those negative effects on the species. And then in turn, Fish and Wildlife Service will prepare a biological opinion. And in that opinion, they list the terms and conditions of that, quote, permit. It's not technically a permit, but we're going to call it a permit for today. Terms and conditions of the permit, so the things that you have to do in order to be in compliance with that biological opinion. And then an incidental take statement, which is going to be a statement that says, I'm approving this project to happen under these terms and conditions, and it will result in X amount of take for so-and-so species, basically. And then you have habitat conservation plans. So these are for projects that don't have a federal nexus. And these are going to be prepared by the landowner or a representative of the landowner. And the outcome is going to be another incidental take statement or permit prepared by Fish and Wildlife Service. So similarly to a biological assessment, they're going to include information on the project activities that are planned, steps that permit holder is going to take to try to avoid and minimize and mitigate for impacts to the species. And then what's different from a BA and an HCP is then that the HCP needs to have a statement that funding is available to actually carry out those avoidance, minimization, and mitigation measures. So recently, back in October, Fish and Wildlife issued the final guidance and tools for northern long-eared bat and tricolor bat consultations. They're slightly different from one species to the other, but for today, we're going to talk about them as if they're the same because they're very similar. So those tools include a D key specific to those two species, which again, we'll get into the details of that in a minute. There's going to be a consultation process for development projects. And in this context, development projects mean anything other than sustainable forestry activities and wind projects. So development projects would apply to everything else. So, you know, the traditional things like clearing a lot to build a building would fall under development projects, along with a whole bunch of other things. There's specific guidance for wind projects. Those have different guidelines for each of the two species. Sustainable forest management guidelines, which we're going to talk about today, and then a frequently asked questions document as well. So the determination key. All right. So this I might also call the standing analysis because the full name of this is the Standing Analysis and Implementation Plan for Northern Long-Eared Bat and Tricolored Bat Assisted Determination Key. It's a mouthful, which is why we just say DKey. This is a voluntary consultation streamlining tool, but I'll be honest with you, most Fish and Wildlife offices are probably going to want to follow it because it makes things so much more simple when dealing with these two species. It is geared toward development projects, but I have used it for some of the stream restoration projects that we're doing in our office, and it is very helpful. But you just have to kind of take the outcome of the D key with a little bit of a grain of salt. And I'll explain that a little bit more later too. Again, this D key is available through IPAC, but will be available through IPAC very soon. Right now, as of today, it is not available. They are making some updates to it. So if you go on IPAC today and you put a project in and you want to go through the D key, you can't do it quite yet, but hopefully it will be up and running again really soon. It provides automatic concurrence for some actions, meaning you're walking through a series of questions, answering those questions, and you're going to generate a biological conclusion. I'll get to that in a second. And that is going to be recorded within IPAC associated with your project and there for the record. Now, if you find out that you want to change some things about your project so that you can lessen your impacts on that species and maybe get a different biological conclusion, you can do that. And your updates will be saved. Your new biological conclusion will be saved. It'll all be right there for you in IPAC, which is fantastic. The link that I've provided there at the bottom is actually the link to the document that kind of explains all the questions that are going to be asked and what the outcome of those answers means in terms of a biological conclusion. So again, if you really want to nerd out and get down in the weeds, you can check out that document. But most people are just going to fiddle around with it in IPAC, and that's fine too. Okay, so in order to determine a biological conclusion, again, you're going to go through that question and answer process. And your options for biological conclusions, not just for bats, but anytime you're working through a process to figure out an effects analysis, let's call it, for a listed species, you may end up with a couple different types of biological conclusions. A no effect conclusions means basically your project's not having an effect on that species at all. Then you may end up with a may affect conclusion, and there's two kinds of those. So you may have a may affect not likely to adversely affect, or a may affect likely to adversely affect. A not likely to adversely affect, there's a spectrum there. So you may have a really small effect or a slightly larger effect, but what you want to try to avoid is getting into the realm of likely to adversely affect. If that's the case, then there's a lot more hoops you're going to have to jump through in order to get your project approved. It's going to mean that you definitely need to prepare either a BA, biological assessment, or an HCP, habitat conservation plan, which is going to be much more involved than just going through a less formal process to get to the point where you have approval from Fish and Wildlife to proceed with your project. And so this DKey is going to look at the project activities. It's going to look at the timing of those project activities relative to the bat life cycle in your area. It's going to look at proximity to known bat records in your area. So things like locations of summer and winter roosts, locations of mist net captures, established foraging areas, things like that. So the kind of project activities that the DKey takes into consideration are things like tree clearing. Again, all these bats are relying on forests and trees in particular for their roosts in the summertime. So that's a big consideration in the DKey. Next would be loud activities like blasting or drilling, things that may particularly have an effect on any bats that are hibernating in a cave nearby, where these activities could, shake the walls of the cave or produce really, really loud percussive noises that would, penetrate the inside of the cave and disturb the bats while they're hibernating. Prescribed burning. So if you're planning a prescribed burn on a forest and there's known tricolored bat roosts there, for instance, and the smoke is potentially going to affect them, or you may burn down some trees that they're roosting in, obviously that's going to have to be considered as well. If you are removing or modifying any buildings as part of your project, that will have to be considered, since some of these bats have been known to roost in buildings. Same with culverts and bridges. So it's not just removing a culvert or demoing a bridge. It could be putting on a culvert extension, for instance. If you were doing anything messing around any of those potential roost sites, that has to be considered. Increased traffic. This kind of ties back into more transportation-based projects, but let's say you plan on going and harvesting a large acreage of trees and you're having to install haul roads and there's a lot more loud trucks going by. Well, if there's a known maternity roost for northern long-eared bat nearby, that could potentially be very disturbing to that bat and that maternity roost. Waterborne contaminants, so runoff that's occurring because of things like increased traffic or a sediment basin that could potentially fail, things like that. And then lighting. Most of you probably aren't doing forest activities after dark, but if you are, you would have to be concerned about a lot of bright lights that might be shining, say, on a creek that is a known foraging area for Indiana bats because it is in the direct path of two known roost trees, for instance. So again, all those things are part of the DKey. You're going to be asked questions about them in a lot of detail. And it is interesting because you first look at all the questions that you have to answer and you think, okay, this is pretty simple. And then you actually get into it, and the way you answer one question may lead to 5 more. So be ready to be patient, and you do not have to answer all the questions at one time. You can log out and log back in, and the answers to your questions have been retained, and you can get started where you left off. So again, I mentioned this earlier, but another thing that has to be taken into consideration by the DKey are things like the timing of the activities and how close you are to known bat records. So one of the flip side of that is one of the things that you can do to minimize your impacts or avoid impacts altogether to some of those bats in the area would be to do things like change the time of year that some of your activities are occurring. or to do them further away from some of those known bat locations. So for instance, I haven't mentioned this yet, but there are survey guidelines for northern long-eared bat, Indian bat, and tricolor bat that are issued or that are updated every year in the spring prior to the commencement of the traditional survey season. And it is a wealth of information. For those of you that don't perform surveys, a lot of it is just going to be something you don't really need to read and get into a whole lot, but there's some gems of information in there. One of those things is way back in the back, there's an appendix where there are a list of seasonal activities for bats. And there are rows for each state and the associated time frame for each of those activities in that state. So I pulled Maryland out of the guidelines, the appendix, for you guys to look at here today. So for instance, one of the most critical times for minimizing or avoiding activities to bats in the summertime would be during the pup season. So you'll see that column next to last on the right-hand side there, between May 15th and July 31st. So this is the time of year after bats have given birth to their young. The young bats cannot fly yet, so they are kind of just stuck there on that tree when mom goes out to forage. They can't really take care of themselves at all. So if we were to cut down that tree or light a prescribed fire, that could have big impacts on those pups that are on that tree. So again, changing the time of year, you're doing your tree clearing to either the winter torpor season or spring staging would be less impactful. Okay, so the sustainable forest management tools. These were updated recently as part of that bigger update that I mentioned earlier. There are 5 tools that provide guidance for forest owners looking to obtain regulatory certainty while maintaining sustainable forest operations. I mean, the Fish and Wildlife Service recognizes that, private forest owners may be concerned about how their activities might affect bats on their property. So they develop these tools in order to kind of give options to those forest owners for things that they can do to minimize those impacts. So I'll go through each one of them. This one we've really kind of already covered, and it is the technical assistance aspect of working with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So again, this kind of goes back to the basics of reaching out to your local office and talking to somebody. It also includes using IPAC to try and work through that D key and make a determination of effects using that screening tool. Next, we have habitat conservation plans and the associated permit there. Again, we've already talked about this, but it's another good option for private forest owners that can benefit them by giving them a permit for incidental take that might occur. And it also benefits the species because that landowner is looking out for the bats and trying to make sure that their activities can still go on, but will be less impactful. Okay. Safe harbor agreements, candidate conservation agreements. I'm going to have to do a little bit of reading here. This is the only entirely voluntary process, and it's the applicant's decision to whether or not to pursue the permit. So under these agreements, forest owners manage the enrolled property and may return it to originally agreed upon baseline conditions for the species and its habitat at the end of the agreement, even if this means incidentally taking the species. So what this means is that the Fish and Wildlife Service recognizes that the landowner is trying to do right by the species, and they're trying to take into account their activities and how those might impact the species. And they basically set up this agreement with Fish and Wildlife Service to be able to carry out those activities and make the habitat on their property better for the species long term, even if that means, say, in the short term, there could be some take. So again, maybe some trees have to be cut down for whatever activity that landowner is hoping to accomplish. But long-term, they've agreed that they're not going to touch this other block of forest over here. So those bats will always have another place to go forage and roost while those other activities are going on. Okay. Biological opinion and take statement. We already talked about this as well. This is when you have a federal nexus, like I mentioned earlier, and there's going to be an action by a federal agency that needs to be carried out and is going to require consultation with the forest or with the Fish and Wildlife Service, obviously, to ensure that the effects of those actions are not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of the listed species because of the activities that they're planning to happen on that piece of property. So this is just that same old discussion we had earlier about the federal agency preparing a biological assessment and Fish and Wildlife Service responding with a biological opinion that basically permits the activity. All right. So, whoops, sorry about that. Wildlife Cooperative Extension Agreement and Section 7 Biological Opinion. So this is a little bit different in the sense that this is a commitment from the landowner that they are going to cooperatively carry out conservation activities for a minimum of 10 years. And these kinds of activities under this kind of agreement would be things that include surveys and monitoring for bats. So say the forest owner is interested in understanding what bats they even have on their property. Well, they might include mist net or acoustic surveys in this agreement. And then monitoring for that full period of 10 years or beyond, just to see if they can see any trends in locations or activity of those bat species. It's geared a lot more toward research, and with the idea in mind that you want to understand the biology of the bats on the property, understand their ecology. It could include things like radio telemetry tracking of bats to understand what roost trees they're using, what parts of the property seem to be most important to those bats. And it's basically implementation of a bat-friendly forest management plan. Okay, so that was the 5 tools. I want to mention a couple other documents that are probably of interest to you and I think are potentially very useful. The Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service collaborated to develop a bat conservation strategy for Forest Service lands in the southern and eastern regions, so Region 8 and Region 9. And it does cover Indian, northern long-eared bat, tricolor bat, and little brown bats. And the idea here is for the Forest Service to proactively manage their lands and the habitats in and around the surviving populations of those bat species to hopefully aid in the recovery of the species through this proactive conservation strategy. So I've included the link there if you want to look that up. That's the link to the Forest Service document. And so Fish and Wildlife has produced a corresponding opinion document that was issued on January 13th of this year. I do not have a link for that online. I do have a PDF copy of it. If you are real interested in seeing that, you can reach out to me via email and I can send it to you. But it more or less mirrors the Forest Service document, but does not include little brown bats because technically they are not proposed for listing or officially listed yet. And much like the structure of the other kinds of consultation documents we've talked about, this one does lay out potential activities, the effects or the potential effects caused by those activities, and then avoidance, minimization, and mitigation measures that can be implemented in order to minimize all those effects of those activities on these bat species on Forest Service lands in particular. All right, and then if you are doing work in New York, Pennsylvania, or West Virginia, there is a draft document in place right now. The 30-day comment period ended at the end of November, so hopefully this will be finalized pretty soon. But it is a multi-bat species conservation plan for development projects. And again, in this sense, development projects means something that is not related to wind and is not related to sustainable forest management. But I did want to point it out because I think it's another good example of the service getting together with a group of people who are interested in performing work that needs to be done or that they want to do, but doing it in a way that is less impactful to bats. So the idea here is to minimize and offset loss of habitat, so mainly removing trees, while still allowing these otherwise lawful activities to go on. So anyway, if you're working in one of those states, you might want to check that out. Again, the link is there for you. And then this one, I thought I would throw this in. It has been around for a while, but I don't hear a lot of people talk about it. And so it's forest management practices that are geared toward cave hibernating bats, so those that are most affected by white nose syndrome. Again, voluntary guidelines here. This is not a regulatory document, but I think it's useful for private landowners or their forest managers, because it includes a lot of best forest management practices to increase the benefits and avoid or reduce negative effects to bats. So I think this one is worth checking out as well, because it could give you some ideas that might not be included in some of the other documents, and again is targeted toward these bats that are most affected by white nose syndrome. Okay, I feel like I just flew through that, but I'm happy to take some questions and we can talk.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I realize that regulatory topics get really complex and often really case specific. So this is a nice kind of broad overview, and we can dig in further. So yeah, I'll remind folks, please do enter your questions for Heather in the Q&A function for us to go over during the discussion. So while we wait for our audience members to weigh in, I suspect Gary has some questions, so I will let him pose those now.
Sure. Heather, let me ask you to quit sharing your screen for a moment so that we can come up and see your face a little bit more clearly, although I must admit the pictures of the bats are quite interesting that you ended with. Let me ask you first an easy question and then a comment, because I may have missed it. I was a little distracted in the last minute or two by another email from one of our participants on a different subject.
Okay.
And that is, here in Maryland, we're looking at the giving the state government the capacity, permission, I suppose, to develop a habitat conservation plan for bats. And there's a piece of legislation pending before the legislature as we speak. I actually testified on it yesterday. House Bill 894 is the House version of it for those in our audience who may be wanting to look at it. And the Senate version comes up for a hearing in a couple weeks. The House hearing was held yesterday, and about a half a dozen or so people testified on it. There was no opposition to giving the Secretary of Natural Resources the capacity to develop such a plan. My question is, are any other states in the eastern part of the United States, because the bat habitat ranges certainly much larger area than Maryland, and it is, at least on the maps I saw yesterday and earlier when you spoke in a different conversation, statewide. So my question is, are you working with any other states where there is a concern about the impact of the bat on ongoing forestry and other operations, because they're just not confined to forestry, obviously? And could you comment on the work of other areas that you may have and how that's progressing in those jurisdictions?
Okay, good question. So I personally am only working on a conservation plan that actually is finalized at this point in North Carolina for the Virginia big-eared bat, which you all don't have in Maryland. But so yes, there are other states working on state-specific plans. A lot of them are pulling from some of these other guidance documents that I showed you. So again, it's a matter of kind of understanding it's a programmatic way to deal with the issues, right? So it's a good thing to sit and look at what kind of activities might be going on within our state that we know are going to routinely happen, where we can go ahead and work on ideas for minimizing the effects of those activities on this target bat species, right? And aside from that, or as an extension to that, thinking about, okay, do we want to start trying to look at options for mitigation that might involve things like an in lieu fee program? So you cut X numbers of trees, you pay into this fund, the fund builds a pot of money that can then be used to purchase, say, private property that might have an important hibernaculum on it. So I'm really speaking in general terms here, but to answer your question, yes, there are other states looking into this and trying to accomplish it. In North Carolina, thus far, it's just been for the Virginia big-eared bat. It has a very limited range in our state. So it was a little easier to kind of start there than with the species that occurs statewide. But yeah, I mean, I hope this is something that is successful for you all in Maryland.
Let me follow up on that if you don't mind, Megan. I was involved in the development of a habitat conservation plan for another species on the Eastern Shore that many of our viewers might be familiar with, called the Delmarva fox squirrel. That's more geographically confined than the bat population. The development of the plan was took a number of years and involved a wide spectrum of stakeholders. Is that a similar process to what you're encountering for the bat population, kind of involving a number of stakeholders
Yes.
from both the wildlife sector, the government sector, the forestry sector, and that they come together over a long period of time and kind of develop these plans and then engage specific landowners who are actually interested in harvest activities or some sort of other economic work on their property in terms of its potential impact on the species that's being addressed. Is that a similar process here that we see for the bats?
Yes, I would say that private landowners are not necessarily involved in the development of the conservation plan, but they are certainly engaged in terms of reviewing the plan. The plan is made available for comment before anything is finalized. So in terms of the stakeholders here, it would have been obviously Fish and Wildlife Service. It would have been state parks, state forest, national forest, some of the local municipalities who own public land or own town property, city property, the things like that that were adjacent to some of the areas that were important for Virginia big-eared bats were involved. So I would say, you know, look outside of state and federal stakeholders and consider your local governments as well.
Well, let me follow up with just one last question and the interest that was exhibited yesterday in the hearing I attended. One of the comments you made, I think, is really important from the standpoint of many people who might see understand the bat population's threatened and that forestry operations might exacerbate that threat. And so the question then becomes, you mentioned the possibility of a forest landowner, of a landowner, let me put it in a broader sense, developing a plan or that might actually improve the habitat as opposed to result in the diminishment of the habitat. Most people think of these things as only moving one way, negatively, that is, you're going to destroy things. But have you had experience with landowners or others who've actually worked to improve the habitat values of specific project areas or projects or any other context in which things get better for the bat as opposed to end up being an significantly adverse action on the bat?
Yes, actually, we are working with a landowner in South Carolina right now that owns a fairly large tract of forest land on the coast of South Carolina. And basically, he is doing everything he can to put protections in place for that property long term, and it extends well beyond bats. He's thinking very comprehensively. He's looking at things like establishing mitigation banks for wetlands and streams, protecting red cockaded woodpeckers with safe harbor agreements. And so he's turned his attention to bats recently, and we are doing a full-scale inventory for him so that we can understand what species of bats he has on the forest. And then we're going to focus in more on what areas of the forest are important to those bat species by doing radio telemetry tracking to try and determine where their roost trees are. In coastal South Carolina, unlike where you are in Maryland, we do have year-round activity of bats because it gets warm enough there that there's insects for them to feed on pretty much year-round. They're only going to go into torpor during the coldest times of year. And there's obviously no caves in coastal South Carolina, so they are not fully hibernating down there. So we're just trying to get a better understanding of what bats are there, what they're doing, what parts of the forest they're using. And then, we can start thinking about management activities that are going to be least impactful for the bats, but still allow him to harvest timber like he needs to do and wants to do. So he can still manage for red cockaded woodpeckers, etc. So it all kind of plays into everything else that he has going on down there. And it is kind of complicated to think about management for all of those things at the same time, but it can be done, and he's willing to give it a go.
So something like a land trust or a state forest or any other land preservation program, such as parks. You mentioned parks as being involved in some of the planning. Those entities could actually undertake a management strategy to improve the quality of their practices for the benefit of the bats on those properties.
Absolutely. Yep.
Fantastic. I just want to stress that not every plan that could be developed or is being implemented are adverse to the future of the bat population. There are habitat benefit values that can be enhanced, not merely undermined by projects.
Exactly. And I just want to stress that I hear a lot when people recognize, kind of where I focused my career, right, on protected species, right? It doesn't mean that you cannot proceed with your project activities. It does not mean that you can't do the things that you want to do on your land. You just have to take a few other things into consideration in so doing, right? You can manage a forest for timber harvest and not adversely affect, say, northern long-eared bats. But you need to understand whether or not those bats are on your property, how they're using your property. You need to understand their life history, so that you're not going and cutting down trees at the time of year when they may have pups on those trees that can't get out of the way. So you can accomplish your goals and have those rare species on your property. It's all about management.
I want to emphasize that because in the case of the Delmarva fox squirrel, what was once threatened in the early 2000s was deemed not threatened in 2015 because of the success of the plans that were developed and their implementation on Maryland's Eastern Shore. And I just want to emphasize the same possibility exists here, which is why I wanted to talk about it, and particularly in light of the proposed legislation. Megan, let's look back and see if there are any additional questions. And I would like you to come back to me at the end to talk about the future of framing the future.
So at this time, we don't have any questions in the queue. So we're welcome to continue the conversation until then. I'll keep an eye out if anyone adds anything to the Q&A chat.
Well, we've emphasized the positive values of habitat conservation plans and the fact that Maryland is currently contemplating giving the Secretary of Natural Resources the capacity to enter into the development of a plan for the protection of the bats. I was really pleased to hear Heather talking about the fact that other states are doing similar kinds of things. Let me add, and you mentioned North Carolina. I was wondering if we've had I'm more familiar with some of the work going on, particularly in enhancing wildlife habitat values in Pennsylvania. Have you worked any with Virginia or Pennsylvania or West Virginia, the states immediately around Maryland that have hardwood forests on this particular subject or other habitat conservation plans over the past couple years?
Not in those states, I have not. I could not speak to any experience there.
Okay. Well, I don't have any additional questions at this time, and so Megan, if you're comfortable with that, let me thank Heather for the presentation. I thought Heather was just excellent, very informative, very helpful, and I want to remind those who are in attendance that the webinar is being recorded and will be available on the MarylandForestryFoundation.org website, because Heather's presentation contained a lot of very specific references and online resources and references to tools that, frankly, some of you are going to want to follow up on or actually more widely share with people you're familiar with, because this is an ongoing issue. It's not one that's going to go away in the next week or two, or even the next year or two. This is one that's going to be with us for the next decade or more as we try to address the diminished habitat values for these bat populations, because frankly, there is in the research that I've read still some concern about how the disease itself that's led to their diminishment can be contained, and what can be done to actually slow it down. And forestry management is simply one of both the impacts and tools that can be used to address the problem. It's not the only one, as you heard Heather talk about culverts, for example, and transportation facilities and road departments and many other land use operations are impacted by these same habitat values. And so it takes a more comprehensive approach than simply looking at what forestry can do to address the wildlife habitat benefits that need to be addressed in order to salvage populations like the white-eared tricolor and other kind of bats that we've been talking about today. So let me thank you, Heather, for the time that making yourself available for your time today. And for those who are tuned into the show, let me spend just a minute asking you to reflect for a moment on what lies ahead in this webinar series. Next month, we're going to have a very unique webinar on the General Progress Indicator, something that I would say almost none of you have probably ever heard about. But frankly, every local elected official and almost every advocate with respect to the benefits of forest cover in Maryland use a consistent phrase, and that is, we say it always contributes to a better quality of life by enhancing the ecological service values of forest cover as a land cover in Maryland. And obviously, that's around 40% of our land cover. You know, as we talk about such general words like quality of life, we kind of want to look and figure out what the heck are we really talking about. And so the state, believe it or not, for the last decade and a half has actually been giving a great deal of thought to this, going back to the O'Malley administration here in Maryland. And a group in the Department of Natural Resources began working in the early 2000s on something called an assessment of the quality of life. It resolved itself into a general progress indicator. That's the new name they came up with it, and you can find it if you're really determined on the DNR website. We're going to ask those responsible for maintaining that index and those who have used that index and those who are seeking its application across the country to be a part of a webinar in March to talk about this. So if you're interested in how we assess things like the general quality of life that we think that we contribute so much to here in forestry, some of you might want to join us and spread the word that that's a program. We're going to be talking about it. In April, we'll be talking about the Urban Forest Careers Camp that we began last year on the University of Maryland campus, and had students actually with nearly 90% of our population living in urban areas. The need to professionalize and generally enhance the number of people who are looking at potential future careers in urban forestry is more important today than ever before. So we've begun a new camp to actually introduce what this option is for high school students on the University of Maryland campus. We want to share with you what that program is all about, what the details of it are, and how your son or daughter can get involved in the program to be offered in July of this year. The following month, we'll be talking about Maryland's largest tree planting program outside the state's efforts itself in its own state forests and other areas. And that program, supported by the state of Maryland now for over a decade, is called Healthy Forest, Healthy Waters. And just this month alone, the foundation has authorized 88 projects in 14 counties. For tree planting. We'll be planting over the next quarter 88,000 trees across Maryland on private property. Many of you'd like to know what that's all about, what it costs, how do you get involved? It's a turnkey program that requires a significant commitment by the foundation, by the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, by DNR, and ultimately by a landowner for the next 15 years to implement that program. It's been going on for over a decade. And literally, thousands of people have participated in it, and nearly 500,000 trees have been planted. It's one of the most significant parts of Maryland's 5 million tree commitment, which is a part of its climate change objectives. Maryland is one of the most progressive states in the nation on these topics. And finally, in June, looking ahead just one quarter, I mentioned at the beginning of this program that Megan was one of our first Mel Fellows. Well, in June, the current Mel Fellows will be talking about their academic and professional experiences over the past year as we look in July of 2025 to open up the application process for the coming year's program for the support of students in higher education interested in natural resource careers and urban and community forestry careers. So join us over the next quarter. Some exciting stuff lies ahead. And we hope that you will continue to put the third Thursday of every month on your calendar for a time to learn about, to share, to ask questions, and to hear people like Heather Wallace talk about the important topics that we think will shape the future of forestry in Maryland for the years ahead. I want to thank again Heather for joining us today, for Megan's and her success in being a wonderful moderator for the program, and for all of you who continue to join us each month and share the information about this ongoing series of programs. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we look to see you again on March the 20th, 2025, for the next program in the series, Framing the Future. Thank you very much for your time today. Anybody want to add a closing comment? Heather, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Megan, thank you very much for your time.
Always a pleasure, Gary. Thank you.
All right. Take care, my friends, and stay warm.